The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
America is free. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare.
This is Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides, a production of LibertyNation.com, going after what the politicians really mean and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
What expectations do you have of political leaders to protect your constitutionally guaranteed rights? There may have once been a time when folks thought that elected representatives would merely tinker around the edges with this policy or that, but in the end, not try to dismantle the very founding documents of the nation. Well, those days seem long gone. James Madison once wrote, "There are more instances of abridgment of the freedom of the people by gradual and silent encroachments of those in power than by violent and sudden usurpations." And that seems to be the state of play today. Death by 1,000 cuts. But how do we stop it? And what cases are on the horizon? And what role do you yourself have to play in protecting American freedoms? Well, that's just what we're going to tackle today. Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides, and on today's special episode, we'll be examining just how far down the road the slow destruction of constitutional rights has really gone. We'll be joined by Editor-in-Chief of Liberty Nation, Lisa K. Donner, to discuss President Biden's mental state and why the media refuse to acknowledge that such a problem even exists. Also, we'll talk with author James Fite on the crashing out of the First Amendment and Jeff Charles on the push against voter ID. And in our Talking Liberty segment with Scott D. Cosenza, we'll be figuring out just how much of a threat the Second Amendment faces today. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news and analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Let's get started. Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio. The United States of America is the only country that guarantees freedom of speech. There's such a unique instance in the world that it's often the rallying cry of those who seek all kinds of freedoms. We saw American flags in the streets of Cuba, in the avenues of Hong Kong. But for all of its international notoriety, it seems that some Americans just don't want it. We're fortunate to be joined by author James Fite to get to the bottom of this anti-First Amendment conundrum. Welcome, Jim.
Thanks.
Now, I'm sure our listeners know this, but included in the First Amendment is the freedom of the press. And so you'd imagine that the media would be protective of this most important amendment. So why do the Fourth Estate denizens seem so keen to deny this right to people with the wrong opinions?
Well, you can't have the wrong opinion, Mark. The problem with having an argument at all is that, one, you have to actually put forth the effort to make the argument. And two, if you lose, you have to accept that you were proven wrong. You have to be a big boy enough to deal with that. And we've gotten to be such a lazy society in general. And, and everyone seems to get their feelings hurt. And of course, the First Amendment, the right to free speech is unfortunately, the right to be offended. Or the right to offend others, I should say. So it's just easier. It's just easier to shut down the argument than to actually have the argument.
All right, yeah. It seems that the modern age is more about silencing your opponents other than dealing with them. And when I was growing up, if you had this appeal to outside authority to stop someone talking, it usually meant that you'd lost the argument. So is that why we have these calls for censorship and cancellation, do you think?
I think it's a big part of it. Like I said, a lot of it has to do with just laziness, but also there's we're an oversensitive society now too. So everyone gets in their feelings and no one has thick enough skin to take that maybe they're wrong, or that maybe not even that they're wrong, but maybe that just you disagree with them. Now all of a sudden, that's just too much. I'm a boohoo. I'm in my feelings. Yeah. At the point that someone is appealing to outside authority to make you stop arguing, the argument's over. On the merits of the argument, you've won, but yeah.
Okay, so as a right guaranteed by the nation's founding documents, being first in that list, some would argue that it's the most important. Others would say that the Second Amendment is the most important because without that you can't protect the first. But so why are so many people so keen to weaken and denigrate the First Amendment?
Well, what's good for you isn't always good for me. What's good for the goose isn't always good for the gander, as it turns out. Everybody wants their own freedoms, and you can have your freedoms, Mark, but only so far as it doesn't get in the way of what I want. You can't offend me. That's a step too far. As for, hey, which amendment's the most important? I think they're pretty well equally important. But you see these same attacks for both of those, the First and the Second Amendment. It's about, I want my rights, but only, and you can have your rights, but only so long as it's convenient for me.
What threats does free speech face today, and has it gotten worse during the era of COVID?
Yeah, I think it has gotten a little bit worse, and I think the era of COVID itself is a great threat to free speech, because you've probably seen how things are being labeled now medical misinformation. If you're at all critical of the vaccine, or if you're critical of the lockdowns or mask mandates or anything to that effect, it's this is medical misinformation. You're killing people. This is now it's a public health crisis. And of course, we see social media, especially, but the left-leaning press as well. Jumping into this with both feet, they're more than happy to do their part, so to speak, and support the proper narrative.
James Fight, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Now, don't go anywhere. Later in the show, we'll be talking liberty with Scott Cosenza, where we'll be finding out how in danger the Second Amendment actually is. Our gun rights on the chopping block in this less than brave new world. Coming soon on Liberty Nation Radio.
For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
It seems stories of President Joe Biden's cognitive issues are narrative non grata in the oh-so-helpful fourth estate right now, where once the topic of a commander-in-chief's mental acuity and ability would have been the leading story, specifically the Trump era, where every Tom, Dick, and Sally with a minor in psychology was welcome to opine on the mental state of Donald Trump. It now seems that we're all playing along with the narrative that Joe Biden is as sharp as he ever was. Well, not all of us. We're joined by Liberty Nation's editor-in-chief, Lisa K. Donner, to talk about the story that must not be named, the sad, slow deterioration of the president, and perhaps more importantly, why the media has taken on the burden of scaffolding this narrative. Thanks for being here, Lisa.
Thanks, Mark. Glad to be here.
So let's travel back in time a little to the G7 earlier this year. We had British PM Boris Johnson correcting the president. We had Russia's Vladimir Putin going solo on the primary press conference, and a whole wealth of gaffes from President Biden that, in the opinion of many, weakened America's presence on the world stage. Why does Joe Biden get a free pass from the Fourth Estate, Lisa?
Well, Joe's their man. They voted for him. They gave him large donations. This is all verifiable information, Mark. So it's really up to us, the loyal opposition, to stop regurgitating the stuff from the left and start pointing out the president's areas of weakness. And some of them are legitimate. That's our job.
True enough, Lisa. You recently wrote a piece on Liberty Nation that explored some, let's call it fairly dark territory concerning the Biden Imposter Syndrome. Now, could you give us a short breakdown of what this is and how you think it manifests in the current president?
Well, Americans call it pop psychology and Brits call it dark territory. I think that's great. Anyway, well, at issue here is the president repeating some very odd phrases. He tends to say, I'm not kidding here, or this is no joke. This isn't hyperbole. I'm not joking. I'm not being a wise guy. Seriously, folks. If you think that I'm making this up, the astute guys at the No Agenda podcast, which is an awesome podcast, put together a little medley that you can play for our listeners. Now, first we have John C. Dvorak, one of the hosts, with the intro.
I do have a setup that I got to mention. Nothing on this medley was repeated. So when Biden says not a joke, he actually said it twice, which he did a couple of times, by the way. And many times he says something 3 times. And when I do some of these, I will like sometimes put in, I will mess with. There's nothing but original material on here. There's nothing repeated. I didn't trick. I didn't add a horn. I didn't add a boing. This is straight up. So I just wanted to make that clear. So here we go.
But all kidding aside, those of you who travel abroad, not a joke, not a joke. I'm serious, heads of state. I give you my word as a Biden. I'm not a joke. Xi Jinping, China, who I know well. We don't agree on a lot of things. He's a bright and really tough guy. These guys actually are betting, I'm not joking, on autocracies. It really has, not a joke. Number one, my message is, let me finish the question. The answer, experts say, we know that this virus is in fact, it's going to be, we know why all the drugs approved are not temporarily approved, but permanently approved. Okay, to allay their fears, that misinformation is going to kill people. Not a joke. Not a joke. I mean, come on, I'm being a wise guy now. So I shouldn't make fun of it. That's good. It's good. It's good that I'm feeling better about it. I'm not being a wise guy now. We will, in fact, reduce inflation. Reduce inflation. Reduce inflation. But it is, I sincerely mean this. Well, guess what? People stop working. People are coming back. And guess what? You understand what I'm saying? Yeah. It relates to what, in fact, is now needed because we're growing. Look, no, I'm not being facetious. I'm not being facetious. You had up to 20 Republicans sign a letter.
Wow. If I ever get to meet the President Biden, I will ask him to tell me a joke.
So why would the American people think the president is always joking about things that aren't funny? And why does Biden believe that no one's taking him seriously? Well, it turns out that psychologists have a name for this odd behavior. It's called the Imposter Syndrome. Experts say there are several types of imposters, 3 actually. But the first I wanted to key in on. It's the I'm not a fraud syndrome. One PhD summed it up this way. Quote, the root fear here is that you will be revealed or unmasked. You often feel as if this is the day your true self will be dug up and exposed, unquote. I honestly don't even think it's worth going through the other 2 types because this one seems to have pegged Biden perfectly. There's some type of anxiety or fear that he's an imposter and will be exposed. And he obviously senses that. Otherwise, he wouldn't be repeating these phrases constantly.
It certainly makes me think that when we talk about his possible mental failings and things, I'm sure that the president himself is certainly aware of these failings, and that could be what's leading to this imposter syndrome element for him, where he's aware that he's not as sharp as he used to be, because for all intents and purposes, for all of his shenanigans and gaffes and insults throughout his very long career, he was a sharp guy. Very much so, and that's clearly not what he is now. And so perhaps he's aware of some of that, those failings, those shortcomings in his mental acuity, and perhaps that's what's bringing about the imposter syndrome, as you call it.
Right. And what is it about somebody when they're constantly feeling like they're not being taken seriously? I mean, that's an issue.
Very much so, especially for the leader of the free world when he's dealing with other world leaders. Yeah. As we saw at the G7. Now, Texas Representative Ronnie Jackson, who also happened to be President Trump's White House physician, he had some damning words about the president. He said that there's a mental deterioration taking place and that this was a big national security risk. He said, and I quote here, "It's only going to get worse. And guess what? We're watching that happen right before our eyes right now," end quote. Now, that's something I'm sure that many of us who watch the president closely are feeling. And he asked an important question. He says, where are the people in our academic medicine that were out there calling for President Trump to have a cognitive test? Where are these people? Lisa, care to take a shot at the answer?
Well, Mark, I've written extensively about Joe Biden's cognitive impairment after 2 aneurysms. And actually, if you look it up on Google, you can't even find information about his 2 aneurysms because they were so long ago. But they do exist and they have been buried. But I've done so because I really think it matters that the leader of the free world has his wits about him. You know, as you say, the left was continually railing about raising the 25th Amendment with Trump. And now when there's actually good reason to discuss it, it's no longer on the table anymore. Look, there's no doubt that Biden suffers from some serious cognitive impairment. Some have suggested he may be manifesting something called the sundown syndrome, which means that, like, once the sun goes down after dark, a person becomes belligerent and agitated. You know, we saw this when he was overseas, and his body hadn't quite adjusted to the radical time change, and he seemed unnecessarily aggressive at times.
Well, that would tie in very well with his recent comments on Democrats drinking children's blood. But we'll get back to that one later. Now, many political commentators on the right predicted that Joe Biden would either resign before 2024 or not be able to serve the full term. Now, if the mainstream media is anything to go by, however, Biden could even now be thinking about running for a second term. And the tune has just changed. Now, you and I, Lisa, we're both old enough to remember all those many years back in the dark days when the world was black and white and dinosaurs roamed the earth. Of course, I'm talking 2020, when Biden himself said that he was a transitional candidate. Right. And the papers ran with that. They accepted the notion that Kamala Harris, if he won the election, would be stepping into the Oval Office soon enough. But it seems everyone soured on the vice president. What happened?
Well, look at Kamala Harris has never been popular. I mean, what has she gotten? A maximum of 2% of the vote anytime she's run, and she's, you know, much like Hillary Clinton, she's got a serious likability problem. Everything she's touched since she's been VP has turned foul. The Dems have figured that out, but they're just not sure what to do with her.
So I may be way out in the left field here, but she's blown her chances, right? And those who were backing Biden as a vehicle for Kamala Harris, they're stuck with her, aren't they?
Well, you know, it's an interesting theory, Mark, but I'm not sure I buy it. I mean, why would they set up a number two that they know they can't win with when their number one already has an expiration date? I mean, that doesn't make any sense to me. So I think more it was classic one-step thinking on the left. Let's bring in a woman of color since race seems to be the big issue. But they boxed themselves into a corner. And she's turned out to be a textbook case of the Peter principle, you know, reaching the level of her incompetence.
Well, let's get back to the president. Now, he can't take the off-the-cuff questions. He continues to come up short when dealing on the international stage. And I think it's fair to say, as we've just discussed, that his mental acuity is measurably worse than when he was campaigning from the Delaware basement. Now, even outlets like CNN, they're begrudgingly fact-checking him. So what's the trajectory now for both Biden and, more importantly, perhaps the media messaging? How do they square this circle?
Well, you know, White House handlers have to keep a close watch. That's why you get things like messages to the president that he's got food on his chin, you know. You never really see him in public after dark. That's another thing. And again, there may be neurological reasons for this. It's really a sticky wicket that they've gotten themselves into, Mark, and we're here to watchdog them all the way to the next election.
Lisa K. Donner, editor-in-chief of LibertyNation.com. Thank you very much.
Doing a great job, Mark. Keep up the good work.
Now, don't go anywhere and don't touch that dial. Later in the show, we'll be talking liberty with Scott D. Cosenza and examining just how in danger the Second Amendment really is. Can it survive in its present form? And precisely who is trying to take away your constitutionally given rights? Later in the show.
America is free. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare.
This is Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides, a production of LibertyNation.com, going after what the politicians really mean and making it all clear for your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
You can't escape it. Whenever the subject of voting reform rears its head, especially when talking about making voter ID mandatory, the media and politicos jump on the bandwagon, ready to sing the song that Black Americans just can't get ID. and the sole reason for demanding some form of identification must surely be racism. It seems this might just be a fallacy. To figure out the actual facts, we're joined by author and podcaster, host of A Fresh Perspective, Jeff Charles. He's been hitting the research on this topic. Welcome, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
So, Jeff, tell me, the whole idea of voter ID being racist, is it a myth or not?
Yeah, it's a flat out lie, and people have known this for decades. And what's interesting about this, Mark, is that over the past year or so, maybe a couple of years, Democrats have been backing off of that talking point, especially in Georgia, because they've seen that people don't even buy it. I mean, even left-leaning publications have run stories talking about how voter ID does not disproportionately impact the Black community. So I think the jig is up, but I was a little surprised to see that there are some who are trying to revive it. So I'm not sure if they plan on going full court press with this again, or if this is just a few Democrats thinking that they're going to rehash the talking point.
Yeah, I did see Raphael Warnock of Georgia, and he said that I've never opposed voter ID, and in fact, I don't know anybody that did. And then, of course, on Twitter, all of the videos came out of.
Same with Representative James Clyburn in South Carolina. Same thing. He tried to backtrack and say that, I don't know anybody who was talking against voter ID, but then, of course, he had. Yeah,
the internet is forever. So, Jeff, let's delve into the numbers a little bit. You wrote a recent article on Liberty Nation that examined the claim that if IDs were required, it could disenfranchise 270,000 Georgians. Now, what are the media ignoring about this figure?
Yeah, I mean, as usual, the media lies by omission, right? So they're not asking the questions. I mean, what this specifically says, and they were referencing an Atlanta Journal-Constitution article, most likely. And all this means is that 272,000 don't have IDs on file with election officials. It does not necessarily mean that these people don't have identification. It just means that they're not on file with election officials, and that is it. On top of that, there is no evidence that this would amount to, or there's no evidence that this additional documentation that people are required to have if they don't have an ID would pose an insurmountable obstacle. I mean, you can still vote. You just have to provide a little bit extra documentation. It's not disenfranchising anybody. So that is where Politico and where Democrats are being a little bit deceptive in not including that information.
Yes, it's not as though those 270,000, just because they don't have the ID on file, it doesn't mean they don't have the ID in their wallet with them every day.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. And on top of that, in a state like Georgia, you can get an ID for free. So, I mean, they have removed a lot of these issues that Democrats have brought up, which I think is why they had backed off of it in the first place. But I don't know where they're going now.
Well, now, correct me if I'm wrong, Jeff, just to get into the broader topic of it, but the idea that folks, especially Black folks, or particularly Black folks perhaps, can't get hold of ID, it's ludicrous, right? I mean, I can't actually imagine somebody existing in the modern world without some form of identification, other than people in the Californian homeless encampments and the Seattle homeless encampments. Maybe they don't have ID, but everybody else, they can't exist without it, right?
Yeah, I mean, you need it to do a lot of what people want to do. I mean, if you want to go out to a bar and have a few drinks, you need an ID. If you want to drive, you need an ID. You need an ID to do a lot of different things, which is why the vast majority of Americans, and yes, that includes Black Americans too, we have IDs. So the argument was never going to be all that successful in the first place. It only convinces people who already want to believe it. And I'll tell you, even homeless people have IDs too. So it's a nutty argument.
I'm glad to hear that they do. I mean, there's no way out of that situation for them unless they have some kind of idea. It's the curse of the modern world. But let's talk about the root causes here. Now, Democrats want us to think that this is racism, or as President Joe Biden says, Jim Crow 2.0. I think he only says that because it rhymes nicely and it's easy to remember. But to any impartial observer, it seems that either they don't want safer elections, or it's a red herring or a canard, something to keep alive a narrative that Republicans are racist. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's all of those, and I'll add something on. it's also an excuse for when they lose. So when they lose elections, they always say, oh, it's because the Republicans suppressed black votes. Now, they know this isn't true, but they do this so that they don't have to take responsibility for the fact that nobody likes what they're selling. Nobody wants to do what they want to do. And it also does help keep the racial narrative alive. Even though it's a bold-faced lie, it's a way for them to continually inject racism or accusations of racism into the discourse. So really, it's a political tool, and it's nothing more than that.
Yeah, racism's a great fundraiser. It's put that on top of your emails going out to people whose lists you've probably bought. The dollars come flowing in. So, Jeff, final question, if I may. What are the polls saying about voter ID nationwide? Now, I do have some idea of what they say, and if my supposition is correct on this, I'm wondering how long can the Democrats really stay on the wrong side of history?
Well, and it seems like what the Democrats' plan is, and this is their plan to win in 2022, promote narratives and policies that are not popular with the American public. I mean, they're doing it with a host of different issues, but on this issue, again, they're against what people believe. Most Americans believe that you should have to show ID when you go to vote. And guess what? The vast majority of black people believe that you should have to show an ID when you go to vote. So it's very interesting that they're pushing this narrative when nobody believes it. Nobody's buying into this, and they're still trying. It's amazing the level of stupid that the Democratic Party is engaging in right now.
Equaled only by their opposition in not coming up with the facts and figures to rebut it, I believe, Jeff. Jeff Charles, thank you ever so much. Much appreciated.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
And we'll be right back after this short break.
For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
The rights and freedoms guaranteed by America's founding documents are, as ever, in the crosshairs. When President Barack Obama said that he would fundamentally transform the nation, his meaning became a wish list for interpretation, a mirror, if you will, into which everyone saw what they wanted to see. With hindsight, many would argue that the transformation was away from a country that honored the Constitution into something that did not. And no rights were more set upon, and this is still true today, as that of the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms. Politicians talk numbers, but only the ones they want you to hear. Joe Biden fails to deal with a crime wave by targeting only the sale of firearms when the vast majority of these crimes do not involve guns. And you, the American people, are left wondering if you may soon become a criminal for practicing your rights. Here to discuss this ongoing battle is Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, constitutional lawyer, and host of the excellent Uprising podcast, Mr. Scott D. Cosenza, Esquire. Welcome, Scott.
Hi, Mark.
What's the root of this constant death by 1,000 cuts assault on the Second Amendment? Is it essentially a fundamental disbelief that citizens should own guns?
Not just a disbelief that they should own guns, but an active effort to keep them from owning guns. You think Joe Biden wants more or fewer Americans independently armed and feeling like they are the masters of their government rather than people who should take direction from their government? I think that answers the question plainly.
We see this so often. There's been quite a few recent stories on this. They have private security and let's be very clear, of armed security guards that cost thousands of dollars, that is paid for by the taxpayer, I might add, but not let Americans protect themselves in the same manner. How do they square that circle?
Mark, I have no idea how they square that circle. They say that they are entitled to, the ones I've heard talk about this kind of thing, is that they have threats to kind of back up the need for such security forces. That's one of the things that they say when they're confronted with the fact that the people that they often claim loudest to represent best. So you think of the proverbial single mother, a woman of color in a bad neighborhood, and where's her help? I don't know where it is. But I know that Nancy Pelosi has no shortage of armed protection for herself and her family.
So I mentioned in the introduction that politicians often talk about the numbers when it comes to guns. And this is something that's certainly echoed across the fourth estate. But they only ever talk about the numbers that they want you to hear. So they never mention the estimated, I believe it's between 2 and 2.5 million defensive uses as recorded by the CDC. So we should, of course, believe the science, the defensive uses of these weapons, or that many of the gun deaths that occur are actually suicide rather than a violent act against another person. So why are the proponents of gun rights so bad at not getting across this message? Why are they so bad at getting across their side of the story?
Well, I think that it's just they're doing the best they can in the face of the tsunami of pressure wave against them. All the Democrat gun, I mean, Joe Biden is one of the most gun-grabbing politicians we've had in a generation in this country, and he's now president of the United States. We're in a fight over whether he's going to be able to get his gun-grabbing kind of the person with the NRA and the organized people who fight for gun rights don't want at the head of the ATF. These are law-abiding citizens, by the way. You know, we don't want mayhem and violence in the streets and people to be able to go buy guns and like supply the Mexican army or drug cartels or violent Antifas. But yet, in any other constituency, those would be the people listened to find out where a good person would be to be the leader of the organization regulating it, namely the ATF. But that's not what we have here. Biden wants to nominate a guy who worked for somebody who denigrated firearms rights and the rights of the people and restricted them. So,
well, I hear one of the most let's call it high-profile gun grabber cases that's taking place at the moment is the New York Attorney General Letitia James, and she's in the process of hunting down the NRA from jurisdiction to jurisdiction at the moment. Are there any new developments on this case?
I have none to report. This is not necessarily a gun control case, much as it is a attacking one of the most effective gun control, or previously anyway, one of the most effective gun control policy organizations. You know, it's a political grab, and it's also her elevating her position to, I think, boy, am I going out on a limb here? I don't think so. It seems like the smart money bet is she wants to be governor of New York or perhaps president of the United States even. And she can do so on the backs of the NRA. And she's doing a fine job of it, too.
It would be quite the campaign claim to say that she was the one that brought down the NRA, I believe.
She's the Dragon Slayer. There you go, yeah.
What do you think are the largest challenges facing the Second Amendment this year?
Well, this is a consequential year for the Second Amendment. We are, right now, the body of the law is in waiting. We are waiting right now until the Supreme Court makes its next ruling on the Second Amendment. It has been years since they have followed up with their McDonald case. So it would be like if the Supreme Court in the abortion case in the area, because maybe people know that better, if they settled Roe v. Wade, but not the legacy of Roe, namely Planned Parenthood v. Casey, which kind of gave Roe teeth in a way. That's what we have with the gun law. We have Heller, and Heller says that it's a fundamental right to keep and bear arms. And we have McDonald, which applied that right to the states. So we have a fundamental right to keep and bear arms, not just against actions of the federal government, but actions of the state government. But yet state governments seem to be able to do all manner of things that frustrate the implementation and exercise of that right without sanction. And that's what we're finally, we believe, going to see resolved with this term of the court. It's New York State Rifle and Pistol Association is the name of the case. And we're going to see whether or not the kind of catch as catch can licensing scheme that New York and other states have that prevent every sort of everyday person from getting a license to carry a gun outside their home is valid or not. And everybody's sort of waiting with expectation or anticipation or anxiety or however you come down on it for the Supreme Court to hear and then rule on that case. I know
on a recent episode of The Uprising, you discussed the abortion case that you mentioned just now, Roe v. Wade, and how that's coming up in the court also. Now, without going into that particular topic, you did mention during the podcast that you hosted that it would take the four justices, which is obviously four justices have to agree to hear a case before it goes before the court. But you suggested that for the justices to take that case, it's indicative or likely that they would be voting one particular way. Otherwise, they wouldn't take this case. Is that also the case with the New York Pistol Association?
Well, it seems so, Mark. It does take 4 justices to take a case. We thought we had one of a similar kind of thread last year, and when they declined to take that case, Justice Thomas shamed his brother and sister justices by mentioning that this right was out there kind of unprotected by the justices in the court, and that it was incumbent upon them to take a case to state what the law is after granting those other landmark decisions. So we have Coney Barrett on the court now, and the watchers do seem to think that there's a critical mass for striking down these odious gun control laws on the books, but we'll see.
And presumably this case for those who do value the Second Amendment, this is a bright light on the horizon. Are there any others?
Well, I would just encourage everybody to plan on being disappointed, and then you won't have your expectations unmet. When the Supreme Court breaks a lot of hearts, and I expect them to continue doing so. So that's what the signs point to. I don't want to ignore the clear pointing signs when I do my analysis of the court, but I have been disappointed in my entire adult life, basically, by the kind of pace of action by the court and the depths with which they're willing to go to assert the rights that I care about, gun rights, for instance, or free speech rights, for instance, rather than perhaps the right to marry or the right to abort a fetus.
Scott DiCosenza, thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark.
Robert Heinlein, the science fiction author, wrote in his popular book, Starship Troopers, quote, "Liberty is never unalienable. It must be redeemed regularly with the blood of patriots, or it always vanishes. Of all the so-called natural human rights that has ever been invented, liberty is least likely to be cheap and is never free of cost," end quote. Yes, he was working off the Thomas Jefferson quote, but the point he makes about liberty never being cheap nor free of cost is an important one. We daily see and hear people talking about how they are staunch defenders of liberty. They make the right noises, they speak with passion, but what do words really cost them? It is those who sacrifice more for the sake of liberty who are its true defenders. In such a lackadaisical and disposable age of cheap thrills and instant gratification, many seem to think that the occasional tweet or social media argument is a substitute for standing up for constitutionally guaranteed liberties. Well, the fact is that it's not. Unlike the passionate preservation of liberty, talk is cheap. When multiple laws are brought forward that remove rights through the back door, it destabilizes everything. It's digging out the very foundations that make the United States founding documents the greatest protections of human freedom and liberty ever applied to a people. You see, if you chop away or undercut one aspect of the Constitution, what's to stop your opponents cutting away at their own section? What will be left but a tattered rag unfit for purpose? Famed lawyer Alan Dershowitz once said, quote, "Foolish liberals who are trying to read the Second Amendment out of the Constitution by claiming it's not an individual right or that it's too much of a public safety hazard don't see the danger in the big picture. They're courting disaster by encouraging others to use the same means to eliminate portions of the Constitution they don't like." And this might be the point that we're at now. But have heart. America has achieved her greatness because of the Constitution, not in spite of it. Those who seek to remove liberty are of the mind that managed decline is the way forward for the nation. And this attitude is doomed to failure because we must always remember one key thing. Liberty is the ultimate driving force in the human heart. It will not be suppressed. It will not be forsaken or cast aside. It will always come again to the surface, bursting with fresh energy, ready to claim its rightful place. And woe betide those who sought to smother it. Thank you for listening to Liberty Nation Radio right here on the Radio America Network. We'll be back at the same time, in the same place next week, where we'll be tackling the issues, putting freedom in the spotlight, letting the world know that the love of liberty and freedom will not go gently into the so-called good night of Dylan Thomas. I want to thank our guests, Jim Fight, Lisa K. Donna, Jeff Charles, and Scott DiCosenza for joining. And most of all, I want to thank you, the listener, for being here. and being part of something very, very special. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. Until next time, I wish you freedom and I wish you liberty.